When Olivia Parker's sledgehammer broke through that concrete floor, she expected to find pipes, or maybe an old foundation. She didn't expect to find a pristine World War II fighter plane that had been waiting 70 years for someone to discover it. She definitely didn't expect to find letters that would rewrite military history. But as she stood there in that hidden chamber, holding documents that proved a decorated general had been silenced for telling the truth, Olivia realized her life savings hadn't bought her just an abandoned airfield. They had bought her the key to a secret the government thought they had buried forever. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked tarmac of what had once been Henderson Airfield, a forgotten piece of Nevada desert that most people drove past without a second glance. Olivia Parker stood at the rustic gate, keys heavy in her oil-stained hands, trying to convince herself she hadn't just made the biggest mistake of her 27 years. The realtor had warned her about buying the property sight unseen, but after 3 months of bidding wars and lost deposits on garage spaces in Las Vegas, this 40-acre airfield had seemed like a miracle when it appeared in her search results for just $90,000. "You sure about this, sweetheart?" The voice belonged to Frank Castellano, owner of Castellano's Auto Repair, where Olivia had worked for the past 4 years. He'd driven out with her this morning, partly out of curiosity, and partly because he genuinely cared about the young woman who could diagnose engine problems better than mechanics twice her age. 90 grand is a lot of money for, well, this. Olivia pushed the gate open, wincing at the metallic screech that echoed across the empty field. 3 massive hangars dominated the landscape, their corrugated metal sides bleached white by decades of desert sun. The control tower stood like a concrete sentinel, its windows long since shattered by wind and time. Weeds pushed through cracks in the runway, and tumbleweeds had collected against the fence like nature's attempt to reclaim what humans had abandoned. "It's perfect," she said, though her voice carried less conviction than she'd hoped. "Look at all this space, Frank. I can finally build the restoration shop I've been dreaming about. Classic cars, vintage motorcycles, maybe even aircraft restoration eventually." Frank scratched his gray beard, a habit he'd developed during 30 years of dealing with questionable automotive decisions. "Olivia, honey, you're brilliant with engines, no doubt about that. But this place has been empty since the 1980s. The infrastructure alone is going to cost you a fortune. Electricity, plumbing, permits. You're looking at another 100 grand minimum, just to make it functional." She walked toward the nearest hangar, her boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The building was enormous, easily large enough to house a dozen aircraft, with sliding doors that must have weighed several tons each. One door hung partially open, creating a dark mouth that seemed to swallow the morning light. "I've been saving for 6 years, Frank. Living in that studio apartment, driving my beat-up truck, eating ramen noodles, all so I could have my own place someday. This is it. This is my chance to build something." The interior of the hangar was a cavern of shadows and dust motes, dancing in shafts of sunlight that leaked through holes in the roof. Their footsteps echoed off concrete walls that rose 40 feet to meet a ceiling supported by massive steel beams. The floor was solid concrete, stained with decades-old oil spots and marked with painted lines that had once guided aircraft into position. Along the walls, workbenches sat abandoned, their surfaces cluttered with rusted tools and parts too worthless to steal. "The bones are good," Olivia said, running her hand along a steel support beam. "These hangars were built to last. Military construction from the 40s, according to the county records. They don't build them like this anymore." Frank picked up a wrench from one of the workbenches, examining the tool with the eye of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. "Henderson Airfield," he mused. "I remember my dad talking about this place when I was a kid. Said it was some kind of training facility during the war. Then the Air Force used it for storage in the 50s and 60s. Been empty ever since the government decommissioned it." "Which is exactly why I could afford it," Olivia replied, her voice carrying the stubborn determination that had gotten her through automotive school, despite being one of only 3 women in her class. "Everyone sees problems. I see potential." They spent the next hour exploring the property, checking the other buildings and surveying the work that lay ahead. The second hangar was in similar condition to the first, though its roof had held up better over the years. The third hangar, however, presented immediate challenges. Part of its roof had collapsed during what the realtor had described as a significant weather event in 2015, leaving the interior exposed to years of rain and desert storms. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven, with sections that had clearly shifted when the roof came down. "This one's going to need major work," Frank observed, stepping carefully around a pile of twisted metal that had once been part of the roof structure. "Might be more cost-effective to just tear it down and start over." Olivia knelt beside one of the larger cracks in the floor, running her fingers along the jagged concrete edge. "Look at this, though. The foundation is still solid underneath. See how the crack runs along this section here? I bet if I can get this loose concrete removed, the underlying structure is fine." "Olivia," Frank said gently, "I admire your optimism, I really do. But you're one person with a limited budget trying to restore a 40-acre airfield that's been abandoned for 40 years. Maybe you should start smaller. Fix up one hangar. Get your business running. Then expand when you have the cash flow." She stood up, brushing concrete dust off her jeans, and looked around the damaged building with the practiced eye of someone who saw broken things as puzzles waiting to be solved. "You're probably right about starting small. But Frank, look at this place. Really look at it. This was important once. People worked here, trained here, maybe even lived here. It deserves better than being left to rot in the desert." As they walked back toward Frank's truck, Olivia's phone buzzed with a text message from her friend Maria, who worked as a waitress at the diner in nearby Pahrump. "Girl, please tell me you didn't actually buy that abandoned airfield. The whole town is talking about it. They're calling you crazy." Frank must have seen her expression change as she read the message. "What is it?" "Apparently I'm the topic of conversation at the local diner," she said, showing him the phone. "Maria says people think I've lost my mind." "Small towns," Frank said with a shrug. "People talk because they don't have anything better to do. Give them something to actually talk about, and they'll forget all about your airfield." But Olivia knew it wasn't that simple. She'd grown up in small towns, moved from one to another as her father chased construction jobs across the Southwest. She knew the weight of community judgment, how quickly someone could go from being accepted to being the subject of whispered conversations and knowing looks. The fact that she was a young woman buying property that most people considered worthless would only add fuel to the fire. Over the next week, as she began the process of having utilities restored to the property, Olivia discovered that Maria had been right about the town's reaction. At the hardware store in Pahrump, conversations stopped when she walked in. At the county offices where she filed for permits, clerks exchanged glances when they saw the address on her applications. Even the electrician she hired to assess the property's power situation seemed skeptical about her plans. "Lady, I'm not trying to be negative," said Dale Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s who'd been wiring buildings in Nye County for 20 years. "But this place is going to eat money faster than you can make it. These old military installations, they're like money pits. You fix one thing, and two more things break." Olivia stood beside him as he examined the main electrical panel in the first hangar, taking notes on everything that would need to be replaced or updated. "I understand it's not going to be cheap, but I didn't buy this place expecting it to be easy." Dale pulled out his flashlight and peered into the panel, making disapproving noises as he cataloged decades of neglect. "Whole system needs to be rewired. Nothing here meets current codes. You're looking at 15, maybe 20,000 just for basic electrical service to the buildings." "What about doing it in phases?" she asked. "Get power to one hangar first, then expand as I can afford it?" "That might work," he admitted. "Start with hangar 1, get you basic service, 100-amp panel, enough outlets for workshop equipment. Run you about $8,000 for that building alone. $8,000. Olivia did the math in her head, subtracting from the account balance that represented 6 years of careful saving and sacrifice. Between the purchase price, permits, insurance, and now electrical work, she was already looking at a significant chunk of her available capital before she'd even begun the real restoration work. That evening, she sat on the tailgate of her truck in the middle of the airfield, watching the sunset behind the mountains that surrounded the valley. The silence was profound. broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the hangar doors and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. For the first time since making the purchase, she allowed herself to wonder if the skeptics might be right. Her phone rang, startling her out of her brooding. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Olivia briefly considered letting it go to voicemail. But Caroline Parker had a way of calling exactly when Olivia was having doubts about major life decisions, as if some maternal sixth sense could detect uncertainty across state lines. "Hi, Mom. Olivia, honey, I just heard from Frank about your Airfield purchase. Are you sure about this? It sounds like quite an undertaking for one person." Olivia closed her eyes, listening to the concern in her mother's voice. Caroline Parker had supported her daughter's unconventional career choices, had even helped with tuition when money got tight during automotive school. But she'd also watched Olivia struggle to find her place in a male-dominated industry, had seen the frustration and occasional heartbreak that came with being consistently underestimated. "I'm sure, Mom, it's going to be a lot of work, but it's exactly what I've been saving for. My own place, space to really build something special." "But sweetheart, wouldn't it make more sense to buy an existing garage? Something that's already set up for automotive work?" It was the same question Olivia had been asking herself, and the answer was complicated. Yes, it would make more financial sense to buy an existing facility. But every garage she'd looked at came with limitations, with someone else's vision already built into the walls and workflow. This Airfield, despite its challenges, offered something she'd never expected to find: complete freedom to create exactly what she envisioned. "Mom, remember when I was 12 and I rebuilt the engine on that old lawnmower Dad was going to throw away?" Caroline laughed. "You had parts spread all over the garage floor for 3 weeks. Your father was convinced you'd never get it back together. But I did get it back together, and when I was done, it ran better than it had in years." Anne. Olivia looked across the Airfield, imagining workshops humming with activity, classic cars and vintage aircraft being restored to their former glory. "That's what this place is, Mom. It's a giant broken lawnmower that everyone has given up on. But I can see what it could become." After ending the call, Olivia walked back toward the damaged third hangar. The building looked different in the evening light, less like a disaster and more like a challenge waiting to be accepted. She'd start with the electrical work in Hangar 1, did basic operations running, then tackle the roof repairs on this building during the winter months when outdoor work was more comfortable. The next morning brought her first real surprise. She arrived at the Airfield to find a pickup truck parked near the gate and an elderly man in faded jeans and a Vietnam veteran's cap examining the outside of Hangar 1. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, a retired Air Force mechanic who lived in a mobile home park about 10 miles away. "Heard through the grapevine that someone finally bought this old place," he said, shaking her hand with the firm grip of someone who'd worked with tools his entire life. "Thought I'd come take a look, see what you're planning to do with it." "Right now, I'm planning to get the electricity working and start fixing up one of the hangars for automotive restoration," Olivia replied. "Eventually, I'd like to expand into aircraft work, but that's probably years away." Robert's weathered face broke into a grin. "Aircraft restoration, huh? You know, I worked on planes for 30 years. Air Force and civilian. Been looking for something to keep my hands busy since my wife passed last year. You ever need someone who knows his way around aircraft engines, I might be interested in helping out." It was the first genuinely encouraging conversation Olivia had about the Airfield since buying it, and she felt some of the weight of isolation lift from her shoulders. "I'd love to hear more about your experience, Robert. Right now, I'm just trying to figure out where to start with all this." They spent the morning walking through the hangars while Robert shared stories about the Airfield's history. He'd never been stationed here, but he'd known mechanics who had worked at Henderson in the 50s and 60s when it was still active. According to base records he'd seen, the facility had primarily been used for aircraft maintenance and storage, handling everything from training planes to cargo aircraft. "The thing about military airfields," Robert explained as they examined the steel framework of Hangar 2, "is they were built to handle heavy aircraft in all kinds of weather. These buildings are probably stronger than anything you'll find at civilian airports. The concrete work alone represents hundreds of thousands of dollars in all construction, even by 1940 standards." In the damaged third hangar, Robert crouched beside the same crack in the floor that had caught Olivia's attention the previous week. This section here looks like it might have shifted when the roof came down. But see how the crack follows this rectangular pattern? That's not random settlement. There's something underneath here. Something underneath? Something underneath? Olivia knelt beside him, tracing the crack with her finger. Like what? Could be utilities, could be foundation work that was done in sections. Military construction sometimes included underground storage, maintenance pits, that sort of thing. He stood up, brushing dust off his knees. Only way to know for sure is to break up this loose section and see what's underneath. The idea of deliberately damaging the concrete floor made Olivia nervous, but Robert was right about the crack pattern. The damaged section was roughly rectangular, maybe 8 feet by 12 feet, and the concrete within that area sounded hollow when tapped. If there was utilities underneath, she'd need to know about them before attempting any major repairs to the hangar. "I've got a jackhammer at home," Robert offered. "Been sitting in my garage for 5 years. We could break up this section, see what we're dealing with, then you'd know how to proceed with the floor repairs." 2 days later, they met at the airfield with Robert's jackhammer and a collection of other tools that made Olivia suspect he was as eager as she was to solve the mystery of the cracked concrete. The morning air was crisp and clear, perfect weather for demolition work that would generate clouds of dust. "Start at the edges where the crack is widest," Robert advised as Olivia familiarized herself with the jackhammer controls. "Work your way toward the center. If there's empty space underneath, the concrete should break up pretty easily once you get started." The jackhammer was heavier than Olivia had expected, and louder. The vibrations traveled up her arms as the tool chewed through concrete that had been poured probably 70 years earlier. But Robert had been right about the resistance. Once she breached the surface, the concrete crumbled away in large chunks, revealing empty darkness underneath. "There's definitely space down there," she called over the noise of the jackhammer. "Looks like maybe 3 or 4 feet deep." They worked for 2 hours, breaking up the damaged section and hauling debris outside in wheelbarrows. As the hole grew larger, it became clear that they'd uncovered more than utilities or a maintenance pit. The space beneath the concrete was a chamber, roughly the size of a small room, with concrete walls and what appeared to be a steel-reinforced ceiling. "This was built to last," Robert said, peering down into the opening with a powerful flashlight. "These walls are at least 2 feet thick, and look at that ceiling work. This wasn't just storage, this was designed to be hidden." Olivia lowered herself through the opening, accepting the flashlight from Robert and beginning to explore the chamber that had been sealed beneath Hangar 3 for decades. The space was about 12 feet square and 7 feet high, with smooth concrete walls that showed no signs of water damage or deterioration. But it was what occupied the chamber that made her heart race. In the center of the room sat an aircraft, though unlike any plane she'd ever seen. The craft was small, maybe 25 feet from nose to tail, with swept wings and a sleek profile that suggested speed and agility. Despite being sealed underground for decades, the aircraft appeared to be in pristine condition, its metal surfaces free of rust or corrosion. "Robert," she called up to him, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You need to see this." Getting the elderly veteran down into the chamber required some creative problem-solving, but Robert's excitement overcame any concerns about mobility. When he saw the aircraft, his reaction was immediate and unmistakable. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, running his hand along the plane's wing. "Olivia, do you know what this is? It's some kind of fighter plane, right? World War II era?" Robert walked slowly around the aircraft, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades working on military aircraft. "It's a '51 Mustang, but not like any Mustang I've ever seen. Look at these modifications, this paint scheme. This plane has been customized for something specific." The aircraft was painted in a matte gray that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams, with no visible markings or identification numbers. The cockpit canopy was tinted dark, and several pieces of equipment were mounted to the fuselage that didn't belong on a standard P-51. Most intriguingly, the plane appeared to be fully fueled and ready for flight, as if someone had simply rolled it into this hidden chamber and sealed it away. Along the walls of the chamber, Metal filing cabinets stood like silent sentinels. Olivia approached the nearest cabinet and tried the top drawer, surprised when it slid open easily. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each labeled with dates and code names that meant nothing to her. But the documents inside told a different story. "Robert, look at this," she said, pulling out a folder marked Operation Nightfall, January 1945. The papers inside included mission briefings, flight plans, and what appeared to be intelligence reports, all stamped with classification levels she'd only seen in movies. Robert joined her at the filing cabinet, his excitement growing as they explored folder after folder of classified documents. "Olivia, this is incredible. These are original mission reports from World War II. Look at this one. Deep reconnaissance over European targets. Pilot Colonel James Richardson." The name Richardson appeared throughout the documents, always in connection with solo missions that seemed to have been conducted in complete secrecy. Flight logs showed missions to Germany, occupied France, even what appeared to be reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union in the months following Germany's surrender. Who was Colonel Richardson? Olivia asked, pulling out a photograph from one of the folders. The black and white image showed a tall, serious-looking man in his 30s standing beside what was clearly the same aircraft they'd just discovered. "I don't know," Robert admitted. "But according to these documents, he was flying missions that don't appear in any official histories. Look at this flight log from July 1945. He was conducting reconnaissance over Soviet military installations 2 months after the war ended." At the bottom of the filing cabinet, in a drawer that required more force to open, they found Richardson's personal effects. A leather flight jacket, maps with hand-drawn notations, and most significantly, a collection of personal letters written in Richardson's own hand. The letters were addressed to his wife, but appeared to have never been mailed. Olivia sat on the floor of the chamber, reading by flashlight, while Robert continued examining the aircraft. The letters painted a picture of a man increasingly troubled by the missions he was being asked to fly. In one letter, dated August 1945, Richardson wrote, "My darling Helen, I cannot tell you where I am going, or what I am being asked to do, but I want you to know that I believe I am serving our country's interests, even if I am not certain I am serving our country's honor." A later letter, from September 1945, was more explicit. "The war is over, but they have not stopped asking me to fly over targets that should not concern us. I am beginning to believe that some in our government are more interested in preparing for the next war than celebrating." The end of the last one. The final letter in the collection was dated October 15, 1945, and its contents sent a chill through Olivia as she read. "Helen, if something happens to me, if I do not return from tomorrow's mission, I want you to know that I hate everything in the place where we first talked about building our dream house. The truth about what I was asked to do must not be lost, even if it costs me my career or my life. Some secrets are too important to keep, and some orders are too dangerous to follow." "Robert," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think Colonel Richardson was killed to keep him quiet." They spent another hour in the chamber, photographing documents and trying to piece together the story of a decorated war hero who had apparently been silenced for discovering something the government wanted kept secret. The evidence suggested that Richardson had been conducting unauthorized reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory, gathering intelligence about military capabilities and troop movements in violation of wartime agreements. When they finally climbed out of the chamber, both of them covered in concrete dust and overwhelmed by what they'd discovered, Olivia realized her life had just become infinitely more complicated. She owned not just an abandoned airfield, but a piece of forgotten history that could potentially embarrass the United States government if it ever became public. "What do we do with this?" she asked Robert as they stood in the damaged hangar, looking down at the opening that led to 70 years of buried secrets. "That's up to you," Robert replied. "Technically, everything in that chamber belongs to you now, but Olivia, this is the kind of discovery that could attract attention from people who prefer that some secrets stay buried." That evening, Olivia sat in her truck in the middle of the airfield, watching the sunset while trying to process what she'd uncovered. The skeptics in town who'd mocked her for buying worthless desert property had no idea that she'd actually purchased one of the most significant historical discoveries in decades. But the knowledge came with weight. She hadn't expected when she'd first broken through that concrete floor. Her phone buzzed with another text from Maria. "Girl, you've got the whole town talking. Old Dale Morrison is telling everyone you're planning to turn that airfield into some kind of theme park. Please tell me that's not true." Olivia stared at the message, realizing that public attention was the last thing she needed right now. If word spread about what she'd found beneath Hangar 3, it wouldn't be long before government agencies came asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The smart thing would be to keep the discovery secret until she could figure out the best way to handle it. But as she read through Colonel Richardson's letters again by the light of her phone's flashlight, she kept returning to his final message to his wife. Some secrets are too important to keep, and some orders are too dangerous to pass. Follow. Richardson had died protecting information he believed the public had a right to know. How could she honor his sacrifice by keeping that same information buried? Over the next few days, Olivia threw herself into the practical work of getting her airfield operational, partly to maintain the appearance of normalcy, and partly to give herself time to think about the Richardson discovery. Dale Morrison began the electrical work on Hangar 1, running new conduit and installing a modern breaker panel that would support workshop equipment. She ordered tools and supplies, began planning the layout for her restoration business, and even placed an advertisement in several classic car magazines announcing the upcoming opening of Desert Wings Restoration. But every evening, she found herself back in the hidden chamber, reading through more of Richardson's files and trying to understand the full scope of what he'd discovered. The documents painted a picture of a covert intelligence operation that had continued for months after the official end of World War II, with Richardson serving as the primary pilot for reconnaissance missions over Dagestan, Soviet territory. The more she read, the more convinced she became that Richardson's death hadn't been accidental. His final missions had taken him over Soviet installations that were clearly being built up for future conflicts, and his reports had documented military preparations that suggested the Cold War had begun months before most historians believed. Robert visited the airfield every few days, ostensibly to help with the restoration work, but primarily to continue studying the Richardson files. His military experience gave him insights into the documents that Olivia lacked, and he was able to translate much of the technical jargon and military terminology. "Look at this mission report from September 19, 1945, Robert said one evening as they sat in the chamber reading by battery-powered work lights. Richardson flew over a Soviet installation in occupied Germany and photographed what appears to be missile testing facilities. This is 2 months after Germany surrendered, Olivia. The Soviets were already preparing for the next conflict. And what happened to Richardson?" Olivia asked. "The letters stop in October, but there's no record of what happened to him or this aircraft." Robert pulled out a folder they'd discovered the previous day, one that contained official communications rather than Richardson's personal writings. According to these documents, Colonel James Richardson died in a training accident on October 16, 1945. His aircraft crashed during a routine flight out of Edwards Air Force Base in California. No witnesses, no survivors, no detailed investigation. The day after he wrote that last letter to his wife. Exactly, and look at this. Robert showed her another document, a transfer order dated October 10th. Richardson was supposed to be transferred to a desk job in Washington, D.C., effective October 20th. Someone didn't want him making that transfer. The implications were staggering. If their interpretation was correct, a decorated American war hero had been murdered by his own government to prevent him from revealing intelligence that contradicted the official narrative about post-war Soviet relations. The hidden aircraft and documents represented evidence of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of military command. "We have to go public with this," Olivia said finally. "Richardson died trying to expose the truth. We can't let that sacrifice be meaningless." Robert was quiet for a long moment, examining a photograph of Richardson standing beside his modified 51. "Olivia, I understand your desire to honor Richardson's memory, but you need to think carefully about what you're considering. The people who ordered Richardson's death, they may be long gone. but the institutions they represented are still very much alive. Going public with this could put you in real danger. Then what's the alternative? Seal this chamber back up and pretend we never found it? Let Richardson's story stay buried forever? Maybe there's a middle ground, Robert suggested. What if we contact a historian, someone who specializes in World War II intelligence operations, someone who could help us understand the full context of what Richardson was doing and advise us on how to handle the information responsibly? It was a reasonable suggestion, but Olivia found herself resistant to the idea of bringing anyone else into the secret, at least not yet. Every additional person who knew about the chamber increased the risk that word would leak to the wrong people, and she still hadn't figured out what she ultimately wanted to do with the discovery. The answer came to her 3 days later, when she was working alone in the chamber, photographing the last of Richardson's personal effects. Hidden behind the aircraft seat, she found a small metal box that had escaped their earlier searches. Inside were additional letters, these addressed not to Richardson's wife, but to specific members of Congress and investigative journalists. The letters were dated October 14th and 15th, 1945, the day before Richardson's death. In them, he detailed specific evidence of unauthorized military operations, naming commanding officers who had ordered illegal reconnaissance missions and providing exact locations of Soviet installations he'd been ordered to photograph. Most importantly, he included references to additional evidence he'd hidden at locations other than the airfield. "There's more," Olivia whispered to herself as she read the letters by flashlight. Richardson hadn't just hidden his aircraft and mission files at the airfield. He'd created a network of hidden evidence, spread across multiple locations, all designed to ensure that the truth couldn't be completely suppressed, even if one cache was discovered. One letter, addressed to a senator whose name she recognized from history books, included a hand-drawn map with several locations marked across the southwestern United States. Each location was labeled with a code name and a date, suggesting that Richardson had hidden additional evidence at sites in Arizona, New Mexico, and California. This changed everything. The chamber beneath Hangar 3 wasn't just a hidden archive, it was the key to a much larger story. Richardson hadn't been just a pilot, following questionable orders. He'd been conducting his own investigation into military activities he believed threatened American democratic values. That evening, Olivia called Robert and asked him to come to the airfield. When he arrived, she showed him the additional letters and the map Richardson had drawn. "My God," Robert said after reading the congressional letter. Richardson was trying to expose a conspiracy that went all the way to the Pentagon. "Look at these names he mentions. These are senior officers who would have gone on to lead NATO and the early CIA." "Robert, what if Richardson was right? What if there was a group within the military that was actively working to start a conflict with the Soviet Union? What if the Cold War wasn't an inevitable result of ideological differences, but was actually engineered by people who believed perpetual conflict was good for American interests?" It was a theory that challenged fundamental assumptions about American history, but the evidence Richardson had compiled seemed to support it. His reconnaissance missions had documented Soviet military buildups, but his letters suggested that similar buildups were occurring on the American side, preparations for a conflict that wouldn't officially begin for several more years. "If this is true," Robert said slowly, "then Richardson died because he discovered that some of his own commanding officers were deliberately escalating tensions with a wartime ally. He was killed for trying to prevent the Cold War." They spent the rest of the evening planning their next steps. The responsible thing to do would be to contact historians and government archivists, people who could properly evaluate the evidence and ensure it was preserved for future researchers. But both of them were haunted by the possibility that Richardson's story could still be suppressed by the same institutions that had silenced him 70 years earlier. "What if we start small?" Olivia suggested. "What if we restore the aircraft and display it publicly, along with some of Richardson's story? Not the full conspiracy theory, just the basic facts about his service and his mysterious death. Let people draw their own conclusions." It was a compromise that appealed to both of them. They could honor Richardson's memory without immediately revealing the full scope of what they'd discovered. And if restoring the aircraft attracted attention from historians or government officials, they'd be in a better position to gauge reactions and decide how much additional information to reveal. The next morning, Olivia contacted a specialist in wartime aircraft restoration, a company in California that had experience with P-51 Mustangs. When she described the condition of the aircraft they'd discovered, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. A P-51 in underground storage since 1945? The voice on the phone belonged to Michael Barnes, a master craftsman who'd restored aircraft for museums around the world. "Ma'am, if that plane has been properly sealed away from moisture and temperature fluctuations, you could be looking at the most pristine World War II fighter in existence. I'd love to come take a look at it." "It's in excellent condition," Olivia confirmed. "But it's been modified in ways I don't understand. Additional equipment, unusual paint scheme, that sort of thing." Field modifications were common during the war. Pilots and ground crews would adapt aircraft for specific missions. Sometimes those modifications make an aircraft even more historically significant. Barnes agreed to drive out from Los Angeles the following week to examine the aircraft and provide a restoration estimate. His visit would be the first time anyone outside of Olivia and Robert had seen the hidden chamber, and both of them were nervous about revealing the secret to an outsider. But when Barnes descended into the chamber and saw the P-51, his reaction eliminated any doubts about his trustworthiness. The man actually wept when he saw the pristine condition of the aircraft, running his hands over control surfaces and examining details with the reverence of someone who truly understood what they were looking at. "This is incredible," he whispered. "The modifications, the condition, everything about this aircraft tells a story. Look at these camera mounts, this long-range fuel system. This plane was configured for deep reconnaissance, probably behind enemy lines." Barnes spent 3 hours examining every inch of the aircraft, taking detailed photographs and measurements. When he finally climbed back up to Hangar 3, his estimate was both encouraging and sobering. "Full restoration would run you about $150,000, he said. "But honestly, this aircraft doesn't need full restoration. It needs careful preservation and minor repairs. I could have it airworthy for maybe $60,000 and display ready for half that." $60,000. It was a significant chunk of Olivia's remaining capital, but the idea of seeing Richardson's P-51 flying again was too compelling to dismiss. And if they were going to honor Richardson's memory publicly, the aircraft needed to be the centerpiece of that effort. Sigh. "How long would it take?" she asked. 6 months, maybe 8 if we run into unexpected issues. But I'll tell you what, this project is so unique that I'd be willing to work at cost. A plane like this belongs in the air, not hidden underground. That evening, after Barnes had left to drive back to Los Angeles, Olivia and Robert sat in the chamber with Richardson's letters spread out between them. The decision to restore the aircraft felt right, but it also meant committing to making Richardson's story public, at least in part. "Once that plane is flying," Robert said, "there's going to be questions about where it came from, who it belonged to, why it was hidden. We need to be prepared with answers that honor Richardson without putting ourselves in danger." Olivia picked up one of the photographs of Richardson standing beside his aircraft, studying the face of the man who died trying to expose what he believed was a threat to American democracy. What if we tell his story as a mystery? Present the facts we know, acknowledge what we don't know, and let historians and researchers draw their own conclusions? "That might work," Robert agreed. "Focus on Richardson the pilot, his distinguished service record, his mysterious death. Save the conspiracy theories until we have more evidence, or until we're sure it's safe to reveal everything." Over the next few weeks, as Michael Barnes began the process of carefully extracting the P-51 from its underground chamber, Olivia started researching Richardson's official military record. What she found painted a picture of an exceptional pilot who'd served with distinction throughout the war, flying dangerous missions over Europe and earning multiple commendations for courage under fire. But there were gaps in Richardson's record, periods where his assigned duties were listed only as special operations or classified missions. The official record confirmed that he died in a training accident in October 1945, but provided no details about the circumstances of the crash or the investigation that followed. "Look at this." Olivia said to Robert one evening as they reviewed her research. Richardson was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in August 1945, but there's no record of what mission earned him the WWII decoration. Just a notation that it was for extraordinary heroism in aerial flight. August 1945, Robert mused. That's right around the time his letters suggest he was starting to question his orders. Maybe he earned that medal for one of the Soviet reconnaissance missions. The process of extracting the aircraft from the chamber proved to be an engineering challenge that required careful planning and specialized equipment. Barnes brought in a team of restoration specialists who worked with surgical precision to disassemble sections of the plane, move them through the opening, and then reassemble everything in Hangar 1. This is like archaeological work, Barnes explained as his team carefully removed the aircraft's wings. Every piece tells part of the story, and we can't afford to damage anything that might provide historical evidence. The work attracted attention despite their efforts to keep it quiet. Dale Morrison, the electrician working on Hangar 1, couldn't help but notice the activity and ask questions. Robert and Olivia had prepared a cover story about discovering the aircraft in storage at the back of one of the hangars, but Dale's curiosity went beyond casual interest. "That's a P-51 Mustang," Dale said, examining the fuselage as Barnes's team worked. "My grandfather flew one of those in the war. But this one looks different somehow. Those modifications, they're not standard." "We're still researching its history," Olivia replied carefully. "It might have been a test aircraft or used for some kind of special purpose." Dale nodded, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind. Small-town electricians had networks of friends and family who shared information, and it wouldn't be long before word spread that something interesting was happening at the old airfield. Sure enough, within a week, Olivia started receiving calls from local historians and aviation enthusiasts who'd heard rumors about a wartime aircraft discovery. She kept her responses vague, acknowledging that she'd found an old plane but declining to provide details until the restoration work was complete. The attention made her nervous, but it also reminded her that Richardson's story deserved to be told properly. She began drafting a presentation that would accompany the aircraft's public debut, a narrative that focused on Richardson's service record and the mystery surrounding his death, without delving into the conspiracy theories suggested by his private letters. 3 months into the restoration work, Barnes made a discovery that changed their understanding of Richardson's final missions. Hidden inside a sealed compartment behind the aircraft's instrument panel, he found additional maps and documents that Richardson had apparently placed there immediately before his death. "These maps are incredible," Barnes said, spreading the documents out on a workbench in Hangar 1. "They show flight paths over Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, with detailed notations about military installations and troop movements. But look at these dates. Some of these missions were flown after Germany surrendered." The newly discovered maps confirmed what Richardson's letters had suggested. He'd been conducting reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory for months after the official end of the war. But these maps also included something else. Detailed intelligence about American military preparations that suggested the United States had been planning for conflict with the Soviet Union, even while maintaining the public pretense of continued WWII alliance. "This is smoking gun evidence," Robert said quietly. Richardson wasn't just discovering Soviet military buildups, he was documenting American preparations for what would become the Cold War. Someone in the Pentagon was planning for that conflict months before it officially began. Olivia studied the maps, trying to grasp the full implications of what they'd discovered. If Richardson's intelligence was accurate, then the Cold War hadn't been an inevitable result of ideological differences between former allies. It had been deliberately engineered by military leaders who believed perpetual conflict served American interests. "Robert, what if going public with this information changes how people understand one of the most important periods in American history? What if Richardson was killed because he discovered that the Cold War was planned rather than accidental?" "Then maybe it's time people knew the truth," Robert replied. "Richardson died trying to expose this. How can we honor his sacrifice by keeping the same secrets that got him killed?" End quote. But even as they debated the ethics of revelation versus secrecy, practical concerns were mounting. Word about the aircraft restoration had spread beyond the local community. attracting attention from aviation museums and military historians. Olivia had received inquiries from institutions wanting to examine the plane, and several offered substantial sums to purchase it for their collections. More concerning were the calls from federal agencies. Someone identifying himself as a representative of the Air Force Historical Research Agency had left 3 messages asking about reports of a discovered military aircraft and requesting permission to conduct an official assessment. The tone was polite but insistent, and Olivia suspected it was only a matter of time before such requests became demands. "We're running out of time to control this narrative," she told Robert as they worked late one evening in Hangar 1, helping Barnes's team with the final stages of the restoration. "Once the government gets involved, Richardson's story becomes their story to tell or suppress." "Maybe that's not entirely bad," Robert suggested. "If official historians examine the evidence, they might be able to provide context we're missing. Richardson's letters and maps tell one side of the story, but there might be other documents that explain his missions differently." Olivia wasn't convinced. The same institutions that had apparently silenced Richardson in 1945 were still functioning in 2025, and she doubted they'd be eager to acknowledge historical wrongdoing, even wrongdoing that was 80 years old. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a military historian from the University of Nevada who specialized in post-war intelligence operations, contacted Olivia after hearing about the aircraft discovery through academic networks. Unlike the government representatives who'd been calling, Dr. Martinez was interested in Richardson's story from a purely historical perspective. "I've been researching post-war reconnaissance operations for 20 years, Dr. Martinez explained during their first phone conversation. "There are references in declassified documents to pilots who conducted missions that aren't reflected in official histories. Your Colonel Richardson might be one of the missing pieces I've been looking for." They arranged to meet at the airfield the following week, and Olivia found herself cautiously optimistic about finally having academic expertise to help evaluate Richardson's evidence. Dr. Martinez was a small, energetic woman in her 50s who approached historical mysteries with the same systematic thoroughness that Olivia applied to mechanical problems. When she saw the restored K-51 and examined Richardson's documents, Dr. Martinez's reaction was immediate and professional. "This is extraordinary," she said, photographing pages of Richardson's mission reports. "These documents fill gaps in the historical record that researchers have been trying to understand for decades." "What kind of gaps?" Olivia asked. "There are references in Soviet archives to American reconnaissance flights over their territory in late 1945, flights that the United States has never officially acknowledged. Stalin actually used those flights as justification for some of his more aggressive policies in Eastern Europe. If Richardson was conducting those missions, it changes our understanding of how the Cold War began." Dr. Martinez spent 3 days at the airfield, documenting everything Richardson had left behind and cross-referencing his reports with other historical sources. Her analysis confirmed much of what Olivia and Robert had suspected, but also provided crucial context they'd been missing. "Richardson wasn't a rogue pilot," Dr. Martinez explained. "He was following orders from a specific intelligence unit that was operating with minimal oversight from Congress or civilian leadership. The missions he flew were part of a broader intelligence-gathering operation designed to assess Soviet capabilities and intentions. But his letters suggest he believed those missions were wrong, that they were designed to provoke conflict rather than prevent it." "That's possible," Dr. Martinez agreed. "There's evidence that some military leaders believed conflict with the Soviet Union was inevitable and wanted to gather intelligence that would give the United States advantages in that conflict. Richardson might have discovered that his missions were being used to justify military buildups rather than inform diplomatic efforts." End quote. The historian's analysis provided exactly what Olivia had been looking for: a framework for understanding Richardson's story that honored his concerns while acknowledging the complexity of post-war intelligence operations. It wasn't the simple story of a hero exposing government wrongdoing that she'd initially imagined, but it was a true story that deserved to be told. "Dr. Martinez, what would happen if we made Richardson's story public? All of it, including the evidence that suggests some military leaders were actively working to escalate tensions with the Soviet Union?" The historian was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Honestly, I'm not sure. Some of the people Richardson names in his letters went on to have distinguished careers in government and military service. Their families and the institutions they led might not appreciate having their legacies questioned, even by historical evidence. End quote. But Richardson died trying to tell this story. Don't we owe him that much? You owe Richardson the truth, Dr. Martinez replied. But the truth is complicated. He was a brave pilot who followed orders he eventually came to question. He died under suspicious circumstances while trying to expose what he believed was dangerous policy. That's a story worth telling, regardless of whether it implicates specific individuals or institutions. Over the next month, working with Dr. Martinez's guidance, Olivia began planning a public presentation of Richardson's story. The restored P-51 would be the centerpiece, displayed in Hangar 1, alongside documentation of Richardson's service record and the mysterious circumstances of his death. The more sensitive intelligence documents would be turned over to academic researchers and government archivists who could evaluate them properly and determine what should become part of the public record. It wasn't the dramatic revelation Olivia had initially envisioned, but it felt like the right approach. Richardson's sacrifice would be honored, his story would be preserved, and researchers would have access to evidence that might help them better understand a crucial period in American history. The public debut was scheduled for Veterans Day, which seemed appropriate for honoring a pilot who died serving his country. Even if the circumstances of that service remained controversial, Olivia sent invitations to local veterans organizations, aviation enthusiasts, and academic institutions, billing the event as the unveiling of a lost piece of World War II history. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, she'd received confirmation from more than 200 people planning to attend, including representatives from several military museums and government historical offices. The attention was gratifying, but also nerve-wracking, as it meant Richardson's story would finally receive the public scrutiny it deserved. 3 days before the scheduled event, Olivia received a call that changed everything. The voice on the phone was crisp and professional, identifying the caller as Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Ms. Parker, I understand you're planning to display what you believe to be a World War II-era aircraft that was discovered on your property. Like to discuss the historical significance of your find and how the Air Force might assist with proper documentation and preservation. End quote. The offer sounded reasonable, but something in Colonel Hayes' tone suggested this wasn't entirely a friendly courtesy call. I appreciate the offer, Colonel, but we've been working with academic historians to ensure the aircraft and associated materials are handled properly. I'm sure you have, Ms. Parker, but aircraft of this vintage, particularly those with potential classified modifications, fall under federal oversight regardless of where they're discovered. I'd like to schedule a visit to examine the aircraft and any associated documentation before your public event. End quote. There it was. The polite but unmistakable assertion of federal authority that Olivia had been dreading. She could refuse the request, but doing so would likely result in more aggressive intervention, possibly including seizure of the aircraft and documents under national security provisions. I understand your interest, Colonel. The aircraft will be on display this weekend as scheduled. You're welcome to attend the public event and examine everything then. Miss Parker, I don't think you understand. This isn't a request for a social visit. The Air Force has legitimate concerns about historical materials that may contain classified information. I need to examine those materials before they're displayed publicly. Olivia felt her stomach tighten as she realized the conversation was heading exactly where she'd feared it would go. Colonel, everything we found has been examined by qualified historians. There's nothing in our presentation that compromises current national security. That determination isn't yours to make, Ms. Parker. I'll be at your facility tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with a team of specialists. Please have the aircraft and all associated materials available for inspection. After ending the call, Olivia immediately contacted Dr. Martinez and Robert. Both of them had been expecting some kind of government intervention, but the timing, just days before the public event, suggested that someone was concerned about what might be revealed. This is exactly what Richardson was afraid of. Robert said when they met that evening in Hangar 1. 70 years later, they're still trying to control his story. Dr. Martinez was more pragmatic about the situation. Colonel Hayes has legitimate authority to examine military materials, regardless of who discovered them. But she doesn't have the authority to suppress historical information, unless it poses a genuine national security risk. We need to be cooperative, but also firm about protecting Richardson's story. They spent the evening organizing Richardson's documents, separating materials that clearly contained sensitive intelligence from those that dealt with his personal concerns and observations. The most damaging documents, the ones that suggested deliberate escalation of tensions with the Soviet Union, were secured in a safe deposit box at a bank in Las Vegas. Far from the airfield and beyond the immediate reach of Colonel Hayes's inspection, the next morning arrived gray and windy, with dust devils spinning across the tarmac as Olivia waited for the Air Force team to arrive. At CRAF, exactly 9 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled through the airfield gate, carrying Colonel Hayes and what appeared to be a team of specialists in military history and aircraft restoration. Colonel Hayes was a compact woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having her authority respected without question. She examined the restored P-51 with professional interest, asking detailed questions about where it had been found and what condition it had been in when discovered. This aircraft shows modifications that aren't standard for P-51 Mustangs, she observed, running her hand along one of the camera mounts Barnes had preserved during restoration. Do you have any documentation about these modifications or the aircraft's service history? Olivia provided the files they'd prepared, which included Richardson's basic service record and some of his less sensitive mission reports. She watched carefully as Colonel Hayes and her team examined the documents, looking for reactions that might indicate which materials were considered problematic. Colonel Richardson, Hayes said, reading through the service record. I'm familiar with his name from other historical research. He had an exemplary record, flew some very dangerous missions. His death was a significant loss for the Air Force. Do you know anything about the circumstances of his death? Olivia asked carefully. Training accident, according to official records. Unfortunately, such accidents weren't uncommon during that period. Pilots were pushing the limits of aircraft performance, and sometimes that resulted in tragedy. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation that revealed nothing about whether Hayes knew the real circumstances of Richardson's death. But as the inspection continued, Olivia noticed that the colonel was asking increasingly specific questions about what else had been found with the aircraft. Were there any other materials discovered with the aircraft? Hayes asked. Personal effects, additional documentation, anything that might help us understand how it came to be stored at this location. Some personal items, Olivia replied vaguely. Letters to his wife, flight gear, that sort of thing. Nothing that seemed historically significant beyond the aircraft itself. Hayes nodded, but her expression suggested she suspected there was more to the story. Ms. Parker, I want to be clear about something. Colonel Richardson flew some very sensitive missions during the war, missions that remained classified for decades after his death. If you've discovered materials related to those missions, they need to be properly handled by people with appropriate security clearances. I understand your concerns, Colonel, but everything we're planning to display focuses on Richardson's distinguished service record and the mystery surrounding his death. We're not revealing operational details or anything that could compromise security. The inspection lasted for 3 hours, with Hayes's team photographing the aircraft and documenting every detail of its restoration. They were particularly interested in the chamber where the plane had been hidden, measuring dimensions and examining the construction that had kept it preserved for 70 years. When they finally prepared to leave, Colonel Hayes handed Olivia a business card and a document that appeared to be some kind of official notification. Ms. Parker, I want you to know that the Air Force appreciates your efforts to preserve this important piece of history. However, I'm obligated to inform you that certain materials related to Colonel Richardson's service remain classified. If you discover any additional documents or information, you're required to notify my office immediately. After the Air Force team left, Olivia, Robert, and Dr. Martinez gathered in Hangar 1 to assess what had just happened. The inspection had been professional and relatively non-confrontational, but the message had been clear. The government was watching. and they expected to be informed about any additional discoveries. "She knows there's more," Dr. Martinez said. Her questions were too specific to be casual curiosity. "Someone has briefed her about Richardson's classified missions." "Which means someone in the government knows exactly what Richardson was doing and why he died," Robert added. "The question is whether they're trying to suppress his story or just control how it's told." Olivia looked at the document Colonel Hayes had given her, noting the official letterhead and formal language that turned her voluntary cooperation into a legal obligation. Maybe it doesn't matter what they're trying to do. Richardson's story is already out there. The aircraft is restored. The basic facts are documented. And Dr. Martinez has academic freedom to research and publish whatever she discovers. The Veterans Day event proceeded as scheduled, drawing a crowd of more than 300 people to see the restored P-51 and learn about Colonel Richardson's mysterious story. Olivia had prepared a presentation that focused on Richardson's distinguished NADI service record, the discovery of his hidden aircraft, and the questions that remained about his death. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Veterans who'd served in World War II and Korea shared their own stories about friends who died in suspicious circumstances. Aviation enthusiasts marveled at the pristine condition of the aircraft and the skill that had been required to keep it hidden for 70 years. Academic historians asked detailed questions about the MRN discovery and expressed interest in conducting additional research. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. An elderly woman named Helen Richardson Morrison approached Olivia after the presentation, introducing herself as Colonel Richardson's niece. "I never knew the full story of what happened to Uncle James," she said, tears in her eyes as she looked at the restored aircraft. "My Aunt Helen, his wife, always believed he'd been killed because he knew something dangerous. She never remarried, never stopped believing that someday the truth would come out." Helen Morrison had brought documents of her own, letters that Richardson had managed to send to his wife before his death, along with family photographs and personal effects that provided additional context for his story. Most importantly, she had information about the locations Richardson had mentioned in his final letters, places where he might have hidden additional evidence. Aunt Helen spent years trying to find those hiding places, Helen Morrison explained. She believed James had left clues about where to look, but she never had the resources to search properly. "When she died 15 years ago, she left me everything, including maps and notes about places she thought might contain James's hidden materials." It was exactly the breakthrough Olivia had been hoping for, a connection to Richardson's family that could provide legitimacy for further investigation into his story. Helen Morrison was eager to support continued research into her uncle's death, and she had legal standing to authorize access to any additional materials that might be discovered. Over the following weeks, as word of the Veterans Day event spread through aviation and military history communities, Olivia found herself at the center of a growing effort to document Richardson's story and investigate the circumstances of his death. Dr. Martinez had been contacted by researchers from several universities who wanted to collaborate on a comprehensive study of post-war intelligence operations. The Smithsonian had expressed interest in acquiring the aircraft for permanent display, and most surprisingly, several former military intelligence officers had come forward with information about classified operations from the 1940s and 50s. But the discovery that changed everything came from Helen Morrison's family documents. Hidden among her aunt's papers was a letter from Richardson that had apparently been mailed just days before his death, a letter that contained detailed instructions for finding additional evidence he'd hidden across the Southwest. "Look at this," Helen Morrison said, showing Olivia the letter during a visit to the airfield. "James wrote this to Aunt Helen, but it was returned to sender because she'd moved to stay with relatives after his death. She never saw it until years later when she was going through his effects." The letter contained a map similar to the one they'd found in the aircraft, but with more detailed instructions and additional locations marked across Arizona and New Mexico. Most intriguingly, Richardson had included specific instructions for accessing what he called his insurance policy, a comprehensive documentation of everything he'd discovered about unauthorized military operations. He hid evidence in at least 6 different locations, Helen Morrison explained. James was an engineer as well as a pilot. He designed these hiding places to last for decades, protected from weather and discovery, waiting for someone to follow his clues. The prospect of additional discoveries was exciting, but it also raised the stakes considerably. If Richardson had indeed created a comprehensive archive of evidence about post-war military operations, finding that archive could provide definitive proof of the conspiracy he'd died trying to expose, but it would also almost certainly attract more aggressive government attention than they'd experienced so far. Colonel Hayes had made it clear that she expected to be notified about any additional discoveries, and Olivia suspected that finding Richardson's insurance policy would trigger a much more serious federal response. "We need to be smart about this," Dr. Martinez advised during a planning meeting at the airfield. "If we're going to search for additional evidence, we need to do it with proper documentation and legal protection, and we need to be prepared for the possibility that we'll discover things the government still considers sensitive." The decision to proceed with the search was difficult, but ultimately inevitable. Richardson had died trying to preserve evidence that he believed was crucial for understanding American history. Helen Morrison, as his surviving family member, had both the legal right and the moral obligation to ensure that evidence was recovered and properly evaluated. They began with the location that Richardson's instructions suggested was most likely to contain significant materials, a site in the Nevada desert about 2 hours from the airfield. According to his map, he'd hidden documents in a sealed container buried beneath what appeared to be an abandoned mining claim. The search required careful preparation and specialized equipment. Using ground-penetrating radar, borrowed from an archaeological survey company, they located what appeared to be a buried metal container, exactly where Richardson's map indicated it should be. The excavation took 2 days, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever Richardson had hidden. When they finally uncovered the container, a military surplus ammunition box that had been waterproofed and sealed, Olivia felt the same excitement she'd experienced when first breaking through the concrete floor of Hangar 3. Inside the container were documents that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Richardson had compiled a comprehensive file on unauthorized military operations, including mission reports, photographs of classified installations, and correspondence between senior officers that documented their planning for potential conflict with the Soviet Union. But most significantly, the container held Richardson's personal account of what he'd discovered, a detailed narrative written in his own hand that named specific individuals and described specific operations that had been designed to escalate tensions with former wartime allies. "This is incredible," Dr. Martinez said as they examined the documents in the security of Olivia's workshop. Richardson wasn't just conducting reconnaissance missions. He was documenting a systematic effort to prepare for conflict with the Soviet Union while maintaining the public pretense of peaceful cooperation. The implications were staggering. If Richardson's account was accurate, the Cold War hadn't been an inevitable result of ideological differences, but had been deliberately engineered by military leaders who believed perpetual conflict was necessary for American security and prosperity. But as they studied the documents, Olivia realized that they'd also uncovered evidence of something even more disturbing. Richardson's final entries described discovering that some of his intelligence was being used not just to prepare for potential conflict, but to actively provoke incidents that could be used to justify military action. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a passage in Richardson's handwritten account. He's describing a mission where he was ordered to deliberately violate Soviet airspace, apparently to test their response and create an incident that could be used to justify increased military appropriations. "That's not just intelligence gathering," Robert said grimly. "That's deliberately trying to start a war." They spent the next week carefully documenting everything Richardson had hidden, creating digital copies of all materials, and preparing a comprehensive report on their discoveries. Dr. Martinez insisted on following proper academic protocols, ensuring that everything they'd found could withstand scholarly scrutiny and legal challenges. But even as they worked to preserve Richardson's evidence, Olivia knew that time was running out for keeping their discoveries secret. The successful excavation had required permits and equipment rentals that created a paper trail, and Helen Morrison's enthusiasm for her uncle's vindication had led her to share news of the discovery with family members and friends. The call from Colonel Hayes came exactly 10 days after the excavation. Ms. Parker, I understand you've been conducting archaeological work related to Colonel Richardson. I need to remind you of your obligation to report any discoveries of classified materials to my office. Colonel, we've been working with qualified historians and following all applicable laws regarding historical preservation. Everything we've discovered is being properly documented and preserved. Ms. Parker, let me be very clear. Colonel Richardson's final missions involved highly sensitive intelligence operations. Any materials related to those operations remain classified regardless of when or where they're discovered. I'm going to need you to turn over everything you've found for proper evaluation. Olivia looked across her workshop at the documents spread across her workbenches. Evidence that a decorated American war hero had died, trying to expose what he believed was a conspiracy against democratic values. The idea of turning that evidence over to the same institutions that had silenced Richardson was impossible to accept. Colonel, I understand your concerns about national security, but Colonel Richardson died trying to preserve this information because he believed it was important for the American people to understand what was being done in their name. I don't think I can honor his sacrifice by allowing that information to be classified and hidden again. There was a long pause before Hayes responded, and when she did, her voice had lost any pretense of collegiality. Ms. Parker, you're in possession of classified government materials. That's a federal crime regardless of how you acquired them or what you believe they represent. I strongly advise you to cooperate with our investigation. After ending the call, Olivia immediately contacted Dr. Martinez and Helen Morrison. They'd anticipated this moment, and they'd prepared for it. Copies of all Richardson's materials had been deposited with academic institutions and legal advocates who specialized in freedom of information issues. The evidence was already beyond the government's ability to completely suppress, even if they seized the original documents. But Olivia also knew that her personal situation had become much more precarious. She was now officially a person of interest in a federal investigation, and her ability to control how Richardson's story was told would depend on decisions made by people with much more power and resources than she possessed. The resolution came from an unexpected direction. 3 days after Colonel Hayes's threatening phone call, Olivia received a visit from Congressman David Chen, who represented the district that included her airfield. Congressman Chen was the son of Robert Chen, the retired Air Force mechanic who'd helped her discover Buress Richardson's chamber. Ms. Parker, my father has told me about your discoveries and the pressure you're receiving from the Air Force. I wanted you to know that you have congressional support for preserving and sharing Colonel Richardson's story. Congressman Chen had been briefed on Richardson's evidence by Dr. Martinez, and he understood the historical significance of what had been discovered. More importantly, he had the political authority to ensure that the materials received proper evaluation by independent historians, rather than being classified and hidden by military bureaucrats. The House Subcommittee on National Security has oversight authority for historical materials related to intelligence operations, he explained. We can provide legal protection for you and the documents while ensuring that legitimate national security concerns are addressed. It was exactly the kind of high-level intervention that Olivia had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. With congressional protection, Richardson's evidence could be evaluated by independent experts who could determine what should become part of the historical record and what might still require classification for legitimate security reasons. The final chapter of Richardson's story unfolded over the following months as academic historians, government archivists, and congressional investigators worked together to evaluate the evidence he'd preserved. The process was careful and methodical, with every document examined for historical significance and potential security implications. The conclusions were both vindicating and sobering. Richardson had indeed uncovered evidence of unauthorized military operations designed to escalate tensions with the Soviet Union. Several senior officers had exceeded their authority in ordering reconnaissance missions and intelligence gathering operations that violated diplomatic agreements and increased the risk of armed conflict. But the investigation also revealed that Richardson's concerns had been shared by other military personnel, and that his death had triggered internal investigations that led to the removal of several officers from positions where they could influence policy toward the Soviet Union. Richardson wasn't the only person trying to prevent unnecessary conflict, Dr. Martinez explained in her final report. His death galvanized opposition within the military to the unauthorized operations he discovered. In a very real sense, his sacrifice succeeded in stopping the escalation he'd been trying to expose. The restored 51 Mustang became the centerpiece of a permanent exhibit at the National Air and Space Museum, where Richardson's story is told as an example of an American serviceman who died defending democratic values against threats from within his own government. The exhibit includes some of his personal effects and declassified portions of his mission reports, but the most sensitive intelligence materials remain sealed pending further historical review. For Olivia, the end of the Richardson investigation marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The publicity surrounding the discovery had established her reputation as both a skilled restoration specialist and a dedicated historical preservationist. Desert Wing's restoration became one of the most respected aircraft restoration facilities in the country, with a waiting list of clients who wanted their vintage aircraft restored by the woman who'd uncovered one of the most significant aviation discoveries in decades. But more than professional success, Olivia had achieved something she'd never expected when she first bought the abandoned airfield. She'd honored the memory of a man who died trying to defend American democratic values, and she'd ensured that his sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. Standing in the restored hangar one evening, watching the sunset paint the Nevada mountains gold and purple, Olivia reflected on the journey that had brought her from being a mocked mechanic with crazy dreams to being the keeper of a crucial piece of American history. The skeptics who'd questioned her purchase of the airfield had been wrong about its value, but they'd been right about one thing. It had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. The hidden chamber beneath Hangar 3 had been preserved as a historical site, a testament to the lengths one man had gone to preserve truth in the face of institutional pressure to remain silent. Visitors to the airfield could descend into the chamber where Richardson had hidden his aircraft and documents, experiencing firsthand the dedication and foresight that had kept his story alive for 70 years. And sometimes, late at night, when she was working alone in her workshop, Olivia would think about Richardson's final letter to his wife, his conviction that some secrets were too important to keep and some orders too dangerous to follow. She'd found herself living by those same principles, and she discovered that the truth, once uncovered, had a power that no amount of government authority could completely suppress. The airfield that everyone had dismissed as worthless desert had turned out to contain one of the most important stories in American military history. And the young woman everyone had mocked for buying it had ensured that story would never be forgotten again.